CBSE Class 10 English, Footprints Without Feet, Chapter 5, Footprints Without Feet by H.G. Wells. Chapter Summary and Solutions. Introduction. The story is about a scientist named Griffin who discovers how to make a man invisible. After committing crimes in London, he runs away to a remote village. However, he runs out of money and resorts to robbery using his advantage of invisibility. This again lands him into trouble and he flees from there also. Theme. The story deals with the brilliant scientist Griffin who degenerates himself into a lawless person. The chapter emphasizes that nothing is good or bad in itself. Science may be used both for the progress as well as for the destruction of humanity. Substance abuse has often made mankind deal with such dilemmas. Misuse of science can turn even a brilliant scientist into a monster. So, we must be careful as to how we use the blessings of modern science. Characters in the story. Griffin, the brilliant scientist who discovers invisibility. Mrs. Hall, the landlord's wife in Iping Village. And Mr. Jaffers, the police constable. There are other minor characters whose names have not been mentioned in the story. Chapter progression and summary. Two boys on a London street were surprised to see fresh muddy footprints of bare feet. But where was the man whose footprints they were? Actually, the boys had been following Griffin, an eccentric scientist who had discovered how to make his body transparent. He was a lawless man, and when his landlord tried to eject him, he burned down his landlord's house. Then he had to remove his clothes so that he became invisible. Griffin entered unseen into a big store to get warm. When the store closed at night, he put on new clothes, ate and drank, and slept on a pile of quilts. He overslept and was seen by the shop assistants in the morning. He again took off his clothes to escape them. Being the cold month of January, he felt cold. He needed to cover himself so that nobody came to know about his invisibility. Next, he entered a theatrical company. He dressed up by wearing bandages on his face, dark glasses, a false nose, and bushy side whiskers. Then, robbing the shopkeeper of his money, he escaped by train to another place. He arrived in Iping Village. In the village, he rented 2 rooms in an inn owned by Mrs. Hall. He told the owner that he had an accident that had affected his face and he did not want to be disturbed. Soon his money finished and he robbed a clergyman's house in the wee hours of morning by using his invisibility. Early that morning, when Mrs. Hall noticed his door ajar, she and her husband went to inspect. Suddenly, the furniture in the room attacked her. Mrs. Hall thought that Griffin was into witchcraft. When Mrs. Hall questioned Griffin, he became wild and started undressing his face bandages. People were surprised to see a man without a face. In the meanwhile, the police constable Jaffers arrived as they suspected Griffin to have something to do with the morning burglary. In the heat of the moment, Griffin lost his temper, took off all his clothes, thus becoming invisible, and knocking down Jaffers, he ran away. Synopsis. The story is about Griffin, a scientist who had discovered a wonderful drug that could make him invisible. He sets his landlord's house on fire, then, taking the drug, he becomes invisible. He runs away without clothes so that his invisibility saves him from being caught. Being the cold month of January, he starts feeling cold and enters a store. Unable to escape with clothes from there, he steals from a fancy dress shop and covers himself properly. Then he arrives in a village called Iping. Here he stays in an inn where the inn mistress considers him to be a mad scientist. His violent nature and necessity to steal once again lands him into trouble. Finally, he takes off all his clothes and runs away from there. He gets into a scuffle with the police and finally, taking advantage of his invisibility, knocks out the constable. Let us now have a look at the question answers. Question number 1. How did the invisible man first become invisible? Answer. The invisible man, who was an eccentric scientist, had been carrying out numerous experiments to prove that the human body could become invisible. He swallowed certain rare drugs and his body became as transparent as a sheet of glass. Question number 2. Why was he wandering in the streets? Answer. Griffin was a brilliant scientist but a lawless person. His landlord wanted to eject him. The tussle with the landlord prompted him to burn down his house. To escape from the crime, he undressed and, taking advantage of his invisibility, he ran away from there. Not knowing where to go, he was wandering in the streets. Why does Mrs. Hall find the scientist eccentric? He had arrived in inclement weather. He had a strange appearance. He did not want to befriend anyone, had no desire to talk, had strange habits, and an irritable temper. He told Mrs. Hall that he had come to Iping for solitude. He did not wish to be disturbed in his work. All these things led Mrs. Hall to conclude that he was eccentric. Question number 4. What curious episode occurs in the study? The answer. The study being referred to is that of a clergyman where Griffin had gone to steal money in the wee hours of morning. Some noises had awakened the clergyman and his wife. Creeping downstairs, they heard a chink of money being taken away from the clergyman's desk in the study. He and his wife looked everywhere, but there wasn't a sign of anybody. Yet, the desk had been opened and the housekeeping money was missing. Question number 5. What other extraordinary things happened at the inn? The answer. On an early morning, the landlord and his wife were surprised to see the scientist's door open. Out of curiosity, Mrs. Hall and her husband went upstairs to investigate. The bedclothes were cold, showing that the scientist must have been up for some time, and all his clothes and bandages were lying around. All of a sudden, Mrs. Hall heard a sniff close to her ear. A moment later, the hat on the bedpost leapt up and dashed itself into her face. Then the bedroom chair started coming towards her and almost pushed her out of the room. Then the door was slammed and locked. Convinced of witchcraft, Mrs. Hall almost fell down the stairs in hysterics. After all this, the strangest thing was that the scientist appeared from the empty room after some time. Question number 6. Griffin was rather a lawless person. Comment. The answer. In a bid to succeed in his experiments, Griffin had become self-centered and lawless. He did not think twice before harming anyone. Just because the landlord wanted him to vacate the house, he set fire to his house. Then he callously attacked the fancy dress shopkeeper and robbed all his money. In Iping, he again stole the money from the clergyman's desk. Back in the inn, he attacked Mrs. Hall with a chair when she tried to enter his room. All these activities and instances prove that he was really a lawless person. The last question, question number 7. How would you assess Griffin as a scientist? The answer: Griffin had carried out multiple experiments to prove that the human body could become invisible. But these experiments were not for any welfare. In fact, they were being conducted to satisfy his own ego. He was no doubt a brilliant scientist, but a lawless one. He wanted to use his discovery to gain power and wealth. So we can say that he was a brilliant